Darkness is not always a place. Sometimes it's a person. Sometimes it's a moment when power stops being human and turns into something far more terrifying. And sometimes, it's a king who believes that the rules of the world don't apply to him. But before we step into the nightmare of what King Xerxes did, you need to understand something. This isn't a story about war, or politics, or empires. This is a story about a father, who became a monster long before history dared to say his name with fear. And boss, once we start, there's no going back. Before we dive into this darkness, if you're new here, hit that like button, subscribe to the History Veil, and share this video with someone who thinks they know history. Because the truth behind ancient empires is far more horrifying than the legends that survived. Now, let's lift the veil. Persia. A land of gold, stone, fire, and kings. A place where palaces touched the clouds and armies stretched across continents like living rivers of steel. And at the center of it all stood Xerxes. A king raised not on love or compassion, but on power, isolation, and the crushing expectation that he was meant to rule a world already trembling beneath his dynasty. Imagine growing up knowing millions live or die because you breathe. Imagine being told your blood is more sacred than entire nations. Imagine being shaped from childhood to believe the sun rises for you, and the moon waits for your permission to shine. That was Xerxes. A king built for worship, not warmth. But even so, no one expected what he would later become. Because the darkness didn't begin with conquest. It began inside his home. Behind the marble pillars, behind the golden walls of Persepolis, behind silk curtains and hidden chambers, the royal family lived under rules so twisted, so suffocating, so inhuman that only one truth remained. Inside the palace, blood was both destiny and curse. Xerxes had daughters the way most kings did, as political weapons. Tools. Symbols. Bargaining chips. But in Persia's royal court, daughters weren't just girls. They were threats. Because if a daughter married a man with ambition, that man could challenge the king's throne. Could gather support. Could build alliances. Could overthrow an empire. So kings like Xerxes controlled everything they touched. Even their own children. But Xerxes? He took control to levels no one talks about in school. Levels that made even the hardened nobles whisper. Levels worse than death. You see, in Persian high society, a princess was only as powerful as the alliances she built. Marrying her off to the wrong family could spark a civil war. Marrying her to the right family could stabilize an empire. But marrying her to no one? Keeping her inside the palace forever? That was unnatural. And dangerous. Because a princess locked away becomes a symbol of fear. Not stability. And Xerxes was a king obsessed with fear. He didn't want rivals. He didn't want potential sons-in-law rising against him. He didn't want noble families gaining leverage through marriage. So he made a decision that would stain his legacy darker than any battlefield. He kept his daughters isolated. Hidden. Caged behind walls of gold. Not allowed to leave. Not allowed to choose. Not allowed to be seen by anyone except the handful of people Xerxes permitted. And the world outside heard whispers. Whispers of loneliness, despair, and psychological suffocation inside the palace walls. But whispers weren't enough to show the truth. The truth was, Xerxes controlled every breath they took. Every moment. Every inch of their futures. And for royal daughters in ancient Persia, having no future was worse than death. Because when a princess has no path, no marriage, no life beyond the palace, she becomes something else. A prisoner in silk. A ghost walking the corridors. A bird born inside a cage big enough to trick her into believing she can fly. But the cage was real. And Xerxes held the key tighter than he held the empire itself. People saw the grand facade, the feasts, the jewels, the festivals, the armies. But behind all that glitter, lived a family drowning in fear. Treasurers murmured. Guards exchanged uneasy glances. Even advisors, who spent their lives praising kings, avoided certain hallways after dusk. Because they heard things. Crying. Arguments. Begging. The sounds of a father's paranoia eating away at the lives of the very children he was supposed to protect. But paranoia is never satisfied. And this? This was only the beginning. What Xerxes eventually did to his own daughters goes beyond cruelty. Beyond fear. Beyond the limits of what we think a king, or a father, could ever be capable of. What happens when a king starts seeing danger everywhere? Not on the battlefield. Not in the councils. But in the faces of the people he claims to love? Inside Persepolis, Xerxes wasn't just a ruler. He was a man cracking under the weight of a crown that demanded absolute fear, absolute obedience, and absolute paranoia. And paranoia, once it starts feeding itself, becomes a monster hungrier than any king. The more power Xerxes gained outside his palace, the more he feared losing control inside it. Every voice sounded like a threat. Every whisper felt like betrayal. Every look from his daughters, even the innocent ones, felt like a political plot waiting to unfold. To the world, he was the king of kings. But inside the palace? He was a prisoner of his own imagination. And when a king's imagination turns dark, no one in his family is safe. People eventually started noticing subtle changes. Windows in the princess's quarters were covered. Their maids rotated frequently, too frequently. Servants who once carried messages or gifts to the princesses were replaced by guards who carried nothing but suspicion. The royal daughters weren't just kept hidden now. They were being erased. Step by step, their world shrank. Rooms they once played in were suddenly forbidden. Courtyards they loved walking through were sealed. Even sunshine became a privilege only granted on certain days, if at all. Imagine being born into a palace made of gold, and realizing it's actually made of locks. But the whispers outside? Those were growing louder. Nobles talked. Priests hinted. Foreign envoys asked dangerous questions like, why has no Persian princess been seen in public? Or, why are the king's daughters not betrothed? Or worse, is the royal bloodline secure? Xerxes heard everything. And each whisper, each rumor, each question pushed him further into the abyss. He believed, truly believed, that letting his daughters marry would destroy him. That the men who married them would challenge his throne. That the alliances formed through marriage would fracture his empire. He feared the future. So he destroyed theirs. At first, it was emotional confinement. Then social confinement. And finally, something far darker. Xerxes began treating his daughters not as people, but as possessions. He dictated when they ate, when they slept, who they could speak to, what they could wear, where they could look, even how long they could stand on a balcony. Every moment was monitored. Every breath accounted for. Every small joy slowly crushed under the weight of his paranoia. And in the palace corridors, where even a whisper traveled like wildfire, there were rumors. Horrifying rumors. Rumors that nobles refused to repeat out loud, because the moment the thought formed, the mind recoiled from it. Rumors that Xerxes' control over his daughters had crossed into the unthinkable. Because what's worse than death? Losing your identity. Losing your freedom. Losing the right to be human. And in the shadows of Persepolis, those royal daughters were losing everything. One servant claimed she saw a princess trying to run through a side hallway at night, barefoot, sobbing, shaking, before she was dragged back by guards. Another said they heard arguments behind locked doors. Not royal demands. Not regal instructions. But desperate pleading. A father's furious voice. A daughter's broken one. Some nights, the palace felt less like a royal residence, and more like a haunted place. Beautiful on the outside. Rotting on the inside. And Xerxes? He didn't see what he was turning into. He believed he was protecting his daughters. Protecting the throne. Protecting Persia itself. But the truth? He was destroying the one thing even kings should never touch, their children's lives. Because when you strip someone of freedom, you strip them of hope. And when hope dies, the soul follows. And yet, boss, this still wasn't the worst thing he would do. The moment that defined Xerxes. The moment that made history tremble. The moment that would be whispered for thousands of years. Was still waiting in the next chapter of this nightmare. Because the King of Kings wasn't done. Not even close. Power doesn't just corrupt. Sometimes, it rots. Slowly. Quietly. From the inside out. By the time Xerxes reached the peak of his rule, he wasn't just feared by enemies anymore, he was feared by his own blood. The palace whispered at night in voices that carried terror instead of respect. Servants walked on the edges of the floor to avoid making noise. Advisors bowed deeper not out of loyalty, but because raising their eyes felt like a death wish. And in the center of all this suffocating fear, were the king's daughters. Girls who should have lived a life of jewels, gardens, poetry, and celebration. But instead lived in a world where every breath felt borrowed. Xerxes wasn't protecting them. He was isolating them. Shaping them. Breaking them. One by one, the princesses began to disappear from the palace routines. They no longer joined festivals. No longer appeared at royal feasts. No longer walked through markets under guard. No longer sent letters, greetings, or gifts to noble families. It felt like they had ceased to exist. And the deeper Xerxes fell into paranoia, the darker his control became. He started restricting what food they ate, not for health, but for control. He assigned new guards every few days, not for safety, but for surveillance. He banned certain maids from ever seeing them again, not for discipline, but because he believed the girls were being corrupted by outside influence. Even harmless things, singing, reading, laughing, became threats. Imagine living a life where smiling without permission could be punished. And then, something changed. A fragile shift. Almost invisible at first. One of Xerxes' daughters, older than the rest, began to fight back. Not with swords. Not with rebellion. With her mind. She questioned everything. Why must she stay locked away? Why was no one allowed to visit? Why was she being punished for simply existing? These questions spread among the sisters like sparks in a dry forest. Small. Harmless. Until they weren't. For Xerxes, questions weren't questions. They were threats. The same kind that topple kings, fracture empires, and ignite civil wars. He felt his grip slipping. And paranoia doesn't ask for truth. It invents it. He convinced himself that his daughters were conspiring against him. That they were plotting to escape. That powerful men outside the palace were waiting for them. That these girls, his own blood, were a danger to the throne. And once a king convinces himself his children are threats, darkness becomes inevitable. One night, a scream echoed through the palace, sharp, terrified, unmistakably youthful. Servants froze. Guards looked at each other in dread. But no one moved toward the sound. Because in Xerxes' palace, moving toward pain meant you might share it. No one knows exactly what happened behind those doors. History never wrote the full details. But something changed that night. Forever. The next morning, the eldest daughter wasn't seen again. Not walking in the courtyard. Not at the balcony. Not behind silken curtains. Not anywhere. Some said she had been moved to a deeper part of the palace. A part no one with free will ever entered. Others said she had tried to flee and was never heard from again. And a few whispered something even darker. That Xerxes had handled the matter himself. And suddenly, every other princess understood. There was no escape. No hope. No future. The palace wasn't a home. It wasn't even a prison. It was a tomb. Beautiful on the outside. Silent on the inside. And full of souls waiting to be buried by a father who no longer saw them as daughters. The youngest daughter, barely old enough to understand the world, stopped speaking altogether. Another began pacing her chamber from morning until dusk, repeating prayers under her breath like a spell that might preserve her sanity. Another kept asking the same question to her maid. Will he ever let us go? No one answered. Because everyone knew the truth. Xerxes wasn't letting anyone go. Not them. Not their freedom. Not even their childhood. And then, when things could not possibly get worse, they did. Because Xerxes reached a point in his paranoia where control was no longer enough. He wanted erasure. Total obedience. Total silence. And the thing he did next, the thing he justified in the name of protecting his throne, became one of the darkest shadows ever cast by a king in ancient history. Boss, brace yourself. The next chapter is the part history tried to bury. The moment where Xerxes crossed a line so horrifying. Even ancient chroniclers hesitated to write his name beside it. There's a moment in every nightmare when you stop running. Because you finally accept there's nowhere left to go. That moment had come for Xerxes' daughters. The palace that once echoed with laughter, poetry, and celebration now echoed with something else, silence. The kind of silence that grows heavy, thick, suffocating. The kind that tells you the danger isn't outside the walls anymore. It's inside, walking the same halls, breathing the same air. Xerxes was losing himself, piece by piece. And when a king loses his mind, everyone under his roof loses their future. The disappearance of the eldest daughter wasn't a warning. It was a prophecy. The palace staff felt it first. Maids avoided looking into the princess's eyes. Guards kept their helmets lowered, afraid their expressions would reveal pity, a crime punishable by exile, or worse. Even advisors, men trained to flatter kings, now flinched when Xerxes entered a room. Because something had changed in him. His paranoia had matured into obsession. He stopped trusting nobles. Stopped trusting generals. Stopped trusting priests. Stopped trusting anyone who wasn't bound to his blood. But the cruel twist? He trusted his blood even less. He started visiting the princess's chambers unannounced, stepping in like a storm, inspecting everything. The food, the jewelry, the beds, the windowsills, the garments. Nothing escaped his suspicion. Who gave you this? Who allowed you to wear this? Why is this curtain moved? Who did you speak to today? His questions weren't questions. They were accusations draped in royal silk. And the daughters? They learned to answer the way prisoners do. Carefully, quietly, without breathing too loudly. But even obedience didn't save them. One day, Xerxes walked into the chambers of his middle daughter, the one known for her beauty, her elegance, her mind sharper than most noblemen. She stood the moment he entered, head bowed, hands trembling at her sides. He stared at her for a long time. So long that the air between them stopped moving. Then he said something she didn't expect. Not an order. Not a command. You look like your mother. For a moment, she thought he meant it kindly. For a moment, she thought there was some part of him still human. But then his face tightened. A memory. A hatred. A wound reopening. Because Xerxes didn't love easily. He possessed. And anyone he possessed, he feared losing. He reached out and touched her cheek, not with affection, but with ownership. The princess flinched. It was slight, barely noticeable, but Xerxes saw it. He always saw everything. His fingers curled. His jaw clenched. His voice dropped to a whisper colder than steel. You cannot belong to anyone else. And in those 7 words, her fate was sealed. That night, the palace shook with arguments so sharp they sliced through stone. A princess pleading. A king demanding. A voice cracking with despair. A door slamming like a thunderclap. Servants hid in storerooms. Guards pretended they heard nothing. The palace pets whimpered behind pillars. Because everyone knew. Xerxes wasn't protecting his daughters anymore. He was claiming them in ways that only a broken mind, a fractured ego, and a corrupted throne could justify. He didn't let them marry. Didn't let them leave. Didn't let them grow. Didn't let them be human. And now, he didn't let them refuse him. History never wrote all the details. Not because they didn't exist, but because some truths were too horrifying to carve into stone. What the chroniclers do say is this. Xerxes did something to his own daughters that made even ancient scribes tremble while recording it. Something that violated blood, culture, religion, and humanity. Something that broke the royal dynasty from the inside out. The next morning, 2 more princesses vanished from public view. Their chambers became sealed. Their names were removed from royal documents. Their attendants were replaced. Their presence erased. Whispers surged like poison. Something unimaginable has happened. The king has lost his soul. His daughters have become sacrifices to his madness. But no one dared speak aloud what everyone feared. And Xerxes? He walked through the palace halls with the calm of a man who believed he had done nothing wrong. Because in his mind, a king's right was absolute. His blood was his property. And fear was how he maintained his throne. But boss, even the darkest kings forget one thing. When you destroy the people closest to you, you destroy your own legacy with them. And Xerxes' legacy was about to crumble. Because what he did next, to the final daughter, is the moment that made ancient historians say, no punishment on earth could match what this king deserved. There are moments in history when the darkness becomes so complete, so absolute, that chroniclers stop writing and simply leave empty space on the page. That empty space? That silence? It says more than words ever could. And when it comes to Xerxes, the final chapter of what he did inside his own palace is wrapped entirely in that silence. By now, the Persian court had stopped pretending everything was normal. Nobles avoided meetings. Priests carried out rituals with trembling hands. Advisors spoke cautiously, like every sentence was walking across thin ice. Because everyone felt it. The shift. That last, horrifying step a paranoid king takes when he stops seeing people at all. And starts seeing only threats. The youngest daughter had become his final fixation. She was the last one left who hadn't broken completely. Still gentle. Still hopeful. Still believing, somehow, that her father might remember he was a father. She would ask the same question every morning. Will today be the day he lets us out? And every morning, the palace answered her with silence. But Xerxes had reached a point where love, logic, and humanity no longer existed. The throne had become his entire identity. And any shadow near that throne felt like the end of his world. Even if that shadow belonged to his own child. The youngest daughter sensed something was wrong long before the palace did. She felt it in the way guards followed her more closely. In the way maids refused to speak longer than a few seconds. In the way the palace musicians stopped visiting her courtyard. In the way the air shifted every time Xerxes passed her in the hall. Not with warmth, but with calculation. It felt like being watched by a storm. Not because it's angry, but because it's about to break. And then one night, the storm broke. No one knows exactly what happened. History only tells us fragments. Half sentences. Shaking handwriting in old manuscripts. Lines scratched out by scribes who couldn't bear to describe it. We know the king summoned his youngest daughter. We know she didn't want to go. We know the guards hesitated, actually hesitated, something unheard of in a Persian palace. We know the hall fell completely silent as she was led toward Xerxes' private chamber. And we know that whatever happened behind that door changed the palace forever. Some said they heard arguing, soft at first, then rising. Some claimed they heard something break. Some said they heard the princess weeping. Others said they heard nothing at all, which somehow felt worse. When the doors finally opened, hours later, Xerxes stepped out first. His face calm. Too calm. Eyes steady. Breathing even. The face of a man who believed he had fixed a problem instead of creating an unhealable wound. The guards waited for the princess to follow. She didn't. The next morning, her chamber was sealed. Her belongings removed. Her attendants replaced. Her name struck off ceremonial lists. Her favorite garden space closed permanently. No explanation. No announcement. No mourning. Just erasure. In ancient records, the phrasing is always the same. She was never seen again. The palace changed after that night. It dimmed. Like someone had taken the sun and locked it in a drawer. Xerxes became colder. Quieter. Harder. Every decision he made afterward carried the weight of a man who had crossed a line he could never uncross. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't regret. It was the numbness of someone who had destroyed the last piece of himself that still remembered humanity. And the empire felt it. Nobles rebelled quietly. Generals grew distant. Cities whispered. People prayed with heavier hearts. Even the royal guards, trained to fear nothing, walked with their heads down. Because they knew. A king who harms his blood will harm anything. And Xerxes? He didn't just harm his daughters. He eliminated his legacy with his own hands. No daughters to marry into noble families. No alliances to strengthen Persia. No hereditary stability. No emotional bonds. Just a throne surrounded by ghosts. Xerxes died years later. But by then, his empire had already started cracking. Not from outside invasions, but from the rot he buried inside his own palace walls. The greatest kings fall in battle. The cruelest kings fall in legend. But Xerxes? He fell in silence. And that silence has echoed for thousands of years. Because the world remembers his conquests, his wars, his victories. But what he did to his own daughters, that's the shadow history keeps whispering about. The wound Persia never healed. The monster behind the marble mask. Some kings build empires. Some kings destroy them. Xerxes destroyed his. From the inside.